At my retirement party, my son stood up and announced, "You are not really my father." His DNA test results exposed a shocking family secret. I had always pictured my retirement party as a simple, sentimental affair. Maybe a few speeches, some laughs, a night of swapping stories, and a final toast to 4 decades in the Detroit Fire Department. Nothing fancy, just close friends and family at Fisher's Banquet Hall, a place Diane and I had been going to for years. And it was almost exactly that, a nostalgic, heartfelt evening. Almost. Diane had gone all out, though. I'll give her that. She organized a slideshow with pictures from my rookie days when I still had my dark, full head of hair and was as lean as a twig. The room was filled with people I hadn't seen in years, friends from the force, old family friends, my brother Ray. Even my son, Aaron, who had flown in with his fiancée, Mira, just for the occasion. He was there laughing, drink in hand, the life of the party. My daughter, Mia, was perched on one of the banquet chairs, laughing and chatting with Diane. It was perfect, for a moment. As the evening wound down, after hours of reminiscing, eating, and drinking, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The kids were happy, Diane looked beautiful and proud, and I had reached the end of a career I loved. I figured the speeches were over, and we could go home feeling proud and satisfied. That's when Aaron stood up, cleared his throat, and changed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. "Dad," Aaron said, his voice steady, but with an edge I'd heard before, his serious tone. The kind he used when he'd gotten into trouble as a teenager or when he had something difficult to say. Everyone turned to look at him, expecting a toast, or maybe one of those inside jokes he loved to throw my way. He looked around, hesitating for a moment, then fixed his gaze on me. There's something I need to share with you all, something I recently found out." I smiled, even chuckled a bit, expecting some jab or joke at my expense. But Aaron's face stayed serious, almost grim. My smile faded, and I noticed Diane's face turn pale, her hand suddenly fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. This might come as a shock to some of you, but, Dad, I took a DNA test. And, well, you're not my biological father." The silence that followed could have swallowed the whole room. I sat there, feeling like he'd just told me the sky was red or the sun rose in the west. Everyone's eyes darted from me to Diane to Aaron, all of them equally stunned. What do you mean, Aaron?" I finally managed to stammer. I could feel Diane's hand slip away from my arm as if I were contagious. Aaron sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at Mira, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then he continued. "Look, Mira and I did one of those ancestry tests last year, just for fun. And, when the results came back, they showed that you and I don't share any DNA. Not even a single marker." My stomach dropped, my pulse roaring in my ears. I couldn't process it. Aaron wasn't my son? I'd raised him, taught him to ride a bike, taken him fishing, grounded him for sneaking out, all of it. And now, he was telling me that none of that mattered, not biologically, at least. That he wasn't mine. Are you saying your mother?" I turned, staring at Diane. "Diane, is this true?" Diane looked down, her face white as a sheet, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She opened her mouth but no words came out. She just shook her head, looking more lost and vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. It's complicated, Jack," she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. Her words felt like tiny daggers, each one sinking deeper. "Complicated?" I spat, not caring who was watching or listening now. "What do you mean, complicated?" "Either it's true, or it's not, Diane." "Did you or didn't you?" "Dad, please," Aaron interrupted, his face pained, caught between me and his mother. "I know this is a shock. It's been a shock for me too." Diane took a shaky breath, finally meeting my gaze. "It was, before we were married, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A mistake, okay?" "It was a mistake, and I thought." "A mistake?" I cut her off, feeling anger boil up inside of me, anger and betrayal like nothing I'd ever felt before. "You had an affair, and you just never told me? You thought you could just keep that from me? From him?" Diane's hands shook, and tears started streaming down her face. "Jack, I loved you. I thought Aaron was yours. I had every reason to believe he was. I never wanted this to come out like this." "Like this?" I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "When exactly were you planning to tell me, Diane? Maybe on my deathbed?" Aaron was staring at us, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. "Can we please not do this here? This isn't how I wanted to bring this up. I didn't even want to do this tonight. No, let's do it now." I barked, standing up. "Since we're all here. Since you've already turned this night into a circus. Go on, Diane, tell everyone. Who is Aaron's real father? Because it sure as hell isn't me, apparently." Diane's lip trembled, and she took a shaky breath, looking away from me, from Aaron, from everyone. "It was a man I knew, just before you and I started dating seriously. His name was Mark Bissett. He was someone we had a brief relationship, and it ended. I never thought about him again. I was with you. I loved you, Jack. Mark Bissett? I practically shouted. The guy from accounting? The same Mark who used to send you flowers when we first got together? You told me he was a friend, Diane. You told me he was nothing to worry about. Diane sobbed, covering her face. I'm sorry, Jack. I didn't know for sure. I thought Aaron was yours. I looked at Aaron, at my son, who was no longer my son, and my heart ached. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that nothing had changed, that he was still mine. But how could I, when it felt like my entire life had been a lie? Aaron took a deep breath, looking between Diane and me. Look, I didn't want to hurt anyone, okay? I had to know. And now I do. But that doesn't mean you're not my dad, Jack. You raised me. That's what matters, right? The words felt like a small bomb on an open wound, but I couldn't respond. I was too hurt, too angry, too betrayed. I'd poured my whole life into being his father, and in an instant, that foundation had crumbled. Ray, who'd been watching from the sidelines, finally stepped in, putting a hand on my shoulder. Maybe we should take a break, Jack. Take some time to process this. But I couldn't. Not here. Not now. I grabbed my coat, ignoring the confused, pitying looks from the rest of the guests, and stormed out. The cold night air hit me hard as I stepped outside, but it did nothing to numb the pain gnawing at my chest. The next few weeks were a blur of silence, avoidance, and sleepless nights. Diane tried to talk to me a dozen times, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was her betrayal. Aaron called, left voicemails, texts, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I talk to him, knowing what I knew? Knowing that he was another man's son? Then, one afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Aaron standing there, looking haggard, his eyes tired but resolute. Dad, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Please. Just let me talk to you. I hesitated, but finally, I stepped aside, letting him in. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I get it, Aaron finally said. I get why you're mad. Why you're hurt. But, you're still my dad, Jack. I grew up with you. You're the one who taught me to fish, to drive, to stand up for myself. None of that has changed. But it has, Aaron, I replied, my voice breaking. It has changed. How can I look at you the same, knowing that I was lied to for nearly 30 years? He looked down, nodding. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. But I know I don't want to lose you. You're the only dad I've ever known, Jack. You're my father, DNA be damned. I sat there, feeling the anger and pain slowly give way to something else, a fragile, painful acceptance. Because as much as this revelation had shattered me, the truth was, I still loved Aaron. He was my son, even if he wasn't my blood. We talked for hours that night, unraveling years of hidden resentments, secrets, and hurts. Diane joined us eventually, and through tears and apologies, we began the slow, difficult process of healing. In the end, Aaron was right. Family wasn't just about DNA. It was about love, memories, and the bond we'd built over the years. And though it would take time, I knew we would find a way forward, piece by painful piece. The weeks that followed our night of reckoning were strange, raw. I kept replaying Aaron's words, Diane's face, and the image of Mark Bissett's smug grin from years ago when he'd still been sniffing around Diane. That name alone made my blood boil. Knowing that this man, who'd sent flowers to Diane even after she married me, was Aaron's biological father, it felt like a cruel, cosmic joke. Diane tried reaching out over and over, but it took a long time before I could look at her without feeling disgust and betrayal twisting my stomach. But when I finally sat down with her, the conversation was as brutal as I'd imagined. We met in a small coffee shop near her sister's place. She'd moved in with her for a while, and I figured it was for the best. Diane sat across from me, her face drawn and tired, looking years older. I barely recognized the woman I'd spent over 3 decades with. Jack, she started, her voice small. I'm so sorry for everything, for lying, for keeping this from you. I never thought it would turn out like this. I never meant to hurt you. Didn't mean to hurt me? I scoffed, unable to help myself. You lied for almost 30 years, Diane. You kept this from me, let me believe Aaron was my son all this time. And you call that not hurting me? She lowered her head, ashamed. I was scared, Jack. I thought I could bury it. I thought it didn't matter because you loved him, and he loved you. I never expected Aaron to find out this way. That makes 2 of us, I muttered, taking a sip of my coffee to avoid meeting her eyes. I wanted to end this conversation, to walk away and never look back. But something held me there, maybe the remnants of love, or maybe just the years we'd shared. Where does Mark fit into all this? Did he know? She shook her head. No, I never told him. He moved out of state a few years after Aaron was born, and I cut all ties. I wanted nothing to do with him. You were the only one I wanted, Jack. I swear. I exhaled, feeling some of the anger drain away but leaving behind a cold determination. I didn't believe for a second that she'd been completely honest with me all those years, and there was a part of me that wanted answers, wanted closure, not just with her but with the whole tangled mess of it. I nodded slowly. Diane, we're done. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with this. You've destroyed the trust we had. But, I have my own plans now. She looked at me, a flicker of fear crossing her face. What do you mean, Jack? What are you planning to do? But I wasn't going to give her a straight answer. This time, she'd have to wonder. The following week, I paid a visit to a lawyer and started the paperwork for a divorce. The decision felt like ripping off a bandage that had been festering for far too long. I also found out through a private investigator that Mark Bissett had moved back to Detroit a few years ago and was running a small financial consulting business. It wasn't hard to track him down. He still had the same smug-looking face, which he proudly plastered on his business website. I felt a spark of satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, I could get some revenge after all. That's when I made my real plan. I was going to let Mark know the truth, that he had a son he never knew about. But more than that, I was going to make sure that this discovery caused as much chaos for him as it had for me. The day I went to see Mark was a crisp autumn afternoon. His office was in a small building downtown. I walked in, half expecting to back out at the last moment, but the memory of Diane's betrayal kept me going. I entered the office, and his assistant ushered me in after a brief introduction. Jack, Mark said, standing up with that same stupid grin, clearly not recognizing me. What can I help you with today? I took a deep breath, sizing him up. He was balding, heavier around the middle, and seemed oblivious to the storm brewing in front of him. I stepped forward, extending my hand with a forced smile. Mark Bissett, I said. We have some things to talk about. About Diane. And about your son. His smile faltered, and he frowned. My son? He chuckled nervously, looking at me as if I were joking. I don't have any kids. Oh, I think you do, I replied coldly, watching the color drain from his face. I pulled out a photo of Aaron, one that made the resemblance between the two undeniable. This is Aaron. He's your son. Diane's son. He stared at the picture, his face going slack, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But, that's impossible. Diane and we weren't serious. That was, years ago. 28 years ago, to be exact, I said. Aaron's a grown man now, but he had to find out through a DNA test that I'm not his father. Imagine how that feels, Mark. Imagine the betrayal, the confusion. But don't worry, he knows all about you now. I could see the panic setting in. His career, his relationships, everything he'd built since then could be affected by this revelation. He slumped in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't know. I didn't ask for this.
Well, neither did I said, barely able to hide the satisfaction in my voice.
But here we are. Aaron knows you're his biological father, and I've encouraged him to reach out. I'm sure he'll have plenty of questions for you. And your wife, if you're still married, she might find this bit of news interesting too. He looked at me, a flicker of terror crossing his face. Jack, please, you don't have to do this. My wife, she doesn't know anything about my past with Diane. This could ruin everything. I shrugged. You and Diane already ruined everything for me. Consider this, a leveling of the playing field. He opened his mouth to respond, but I turned on my heel, feeling a rush of satisfaction as I walked out of his office. I didn't need to see his reaction. I knew his life would be in chaos after this. And as for Diane, I knew that Mark's reappearance and Aaron's sudden interest in connecting with his biological father would only remind her of her betrayal. She would have to live with the fallout of her choices, just as I'd had to. Over the next few months, Aaron did meet with Mark, though their relationship was strained at best. Aaron couldn't forgive Mark for being absent, even if he hadn't known, and he didn't feel much of a connection to him. Diane tried to reconcile with Aaron, but their relationship remained tense, the lie she'd lived finally unmasked. I had my peace in seeing them all dealing with the aftermath of their choices. Diane ended up moving out of town, unable to bear the weight of the broken relationships left behind. And me? I picked up the pieces and found a new path. I joined a local veterans group, volunteered at the fire department in a mentor role, and even took up fishing again, just for myself this time. Life moved on, quieter, simpler. There were still scars, but I'd found a strange kind of solace in knowing that justice, in its own messy way, had been served. And sometimes, on a crisp autumn day, I'd drive by Mark's office, wondering how he was dealing with the fallout of his own choices, the hidden past he'd tried to bury. It was a small satisfaction, perhaps, but enough to remind me that, in the end, I'd taken back my life, on my terms. And that was all the closure I needed.